Welcome to the Integral Stage and to another special episode of the Future Faces of Spirit series. Today we're happy to be joined by Alexander Bard, the co-creator of Syntheism, which I'm discovering to be a very interesting emergent religion for the internet age. Alexander is prodigiously creative and productive as the author of multiple books, as a musician and music producer, a lecturer and TV personality, and a religious and political activist. Using Roy Boscar's words, he's also a philosophical and theological underlaborer for Burning Man, hoping to articulate its implicit religious dimensions and promise. All right, well, welcome, Alexander. Really great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And I would like to start off with a question that relates to our, I think, strong mutual points of resonance first. Layman has a model that he calls metaphysics of adjacency, and I have something that's integral grammatology and prepositional metaphysics, and both of them can be seen as a kind of relational metaphysics, which I think is also foundational to Syntheism. So I'm really interested in your take on what is relationism, how does it differ from relativism or other predominant metaphysical frames, or what is its importance right now? How do you see it playing a special role in this time?
Oh, huge question. Okay, so my philosophical heritage coming from Europe is really a dance between Hegel and Nietzsche. And Hegel taught me how to think, and Nietzsche certainly put sort of the pathos into my life, like the desires and the drives that motivate me. And I've always thought that the opposition between Hegel and Nietzsche that European philosophers obsessed with is kind of weird, because I actually read Hegel through Nietzsche and I read Nietzsche through Hegel. But there is a really strong connection to American philosophy here. My two great heroes of American philosophy are Charles Sanders Peirce from the 19th century, and certainly the British American philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead from the 20th century. And it is Whitehead who really put the term relationalism out there. And my co-writer, Jan Söderqvist, and I, we borrowed the term relationalism from him. That should then be compared with Hegelian dialectics, because Hegel is really the first major thinker of process in the West. He brings process thinking to the West, although process thinking has been the dominant mode in the East. It only came to the West through Hegel. In Hegel's response to Spinoza and Kant, that's how process became the predominant mode of thinking in the West. You know, the opposition to Plato starts with Hegel. And Whitehead, to me, represents a really strong American connection for me. And that's how I explored the great revolution of American pragmatism in the 19th century. I read Peirce, of course, then later comes William James, who, by the way, is the father of modern psychology. John Dewey comes later, who's a great social thinker in American history. And they're modern equivalents like Richard Rorty and other guys that come later. But I was obsessed with Whitehead when I was younger. And Söderqvist, I refer to Whitehead constantly. And relationalism is interesting for three different reasons. It is interesting because it is the logical next step in process philosophy. So to understand the world fully and avoid the different traps that we know we try to avoid, we do philosophy properly, relationalism is the way to go. So that's the metaphysical aspect of why I'm interested in relationalism. The other one is that there were two major revolutions in the 20th century that really changed everything for us. The first of those two revolutions was the one in cosmology. And with cosmology, I also count quantum mechanics and relativity theory and Einstein and Bohr and all the other guys, and what happened in physics especially, and how that eventually leads us into the revolution in biology that we're seeing today in the 21st century. So that was a massive scientific revolution. Ironically, why the sense of space that we used to live with, as Marshall McLuhan has pointed out, disappeared with the arrival of the telegraph. And of course, since then, you can take a jet flight anywhere in the world. Within 24 hours, you can arrive there, but you can talk to anybody in the world these days through Zoom in real time, meaning that space has disappeared and time has become more important than space to us human beings, which is very Whiteheadian. So that is a cosmological revolution. But then there's, of course, also the internet revolution that Jan Söderqvist and I date to the 1980s. And we say the internet revolution basically means that we put a bunch of satellites into space. And these satellites reflect human life. And we've discovered that planet Earth is our home. And planet Earth is not run in a sustainable manner. And this has led to enormous consequences for our understanding of ourselves and our relationship to the world. And it also means that everybody, 8 billion people on the planet, are directly connected to one another. And they're creating data flows as they're connected to one another. And the data is then being stored and processed, and AI and other developments can really change everything for us, hopefully for the better. It might even be what saves us ultimately. So all of these revolutions together, you can call them network dynamics. If you take a Marshall McLuhan-like take on the internet revolution, you can call it relationalism, as Whitehead did. Whitehead basically created the philosophy that made relativity theory and quantum mechanics possible. He was ahead of Bohr in that department. And you could also think of Hegelian dialectics in understanding all of these things. And in all of these things, dialectics, relationalism, network dynamics are just different terms for understanding the process of complexity and the process of systems, which is how we try to understand the world today.
Okay. I think I agree with all of that, and I want to bring it back around to God. For me, this kind of new metaphysics, network-oriented, relational-oriented, emergence-oriented, existentially open, it's the basis for me for thinking about generating analogs to religion and spirituality that allow us to access what our ancestors called the divine experience, but in a way that's inherently post-Nietzschean, post-Deleuzian, post-Zizekian, that's up to date with our current understanding and our emerging challenges. And the way I usually do that is through the integration to surplus model, where the intra-psychic elements of the individual and the interpersonal modes of being in culture can come together to create a spiritual surplus for the individual, or a cultural surplus for a collection of people, which allows them to have these enacted transcendental experiences. So where do you see the relationship between the kind of metaphysics you're talking about and the spiritual and religious need? Where does it become syntheism? Where does it become religious?
Oh, okay. I grew up with an uncle who was like my second dad, and he was a professor of theology and philosophy. And I learned early on when I was 6 years old, the theology is really deep philosophy. So the deeper you go into the philosophical realm and you approach metaphysics eventually, you're going to go theological sooner or later. And the take we did in the Syntheism book that I co-wrote with John Söderqvist is basically we start the book by saying that everything is religion. And if you pretend it's not religion, that's when it gets really dangerous. So at least we have a sort of a religious worldview, whether we like it or not. Everything we see around us is religious. I mean, political ideologies are religious convictions. Sometimes they're fortunately also very fundamentalist. But religion is how we deal with the world. We can call it metaphysics if you like. But religion is also how we contain ourselves, domesticate ourselves, if we're brutal about it, also how we castrate ourselves to become what we want to be, or we desire to be, rather than just, run with no impulse control through life, like some kind of mad people or whatever, some kind of animals. I mean, the whole point of being human is to contain yourself, to achieve something higher, more noble. Would you just be in your natural state? We can call it culture if you like, but without religion, culture is impossible. Let's put it that way. So a take we did was that we basically said that isn't the whole idea that you either believe in God and you assume it's some kind of old man sitting on a cloud, or you don't believe in that God and then you're an atheist and the whole thing's over. Isn't that kind of ridiculous, that assumption? To begin with, if you think of God as the creator who somehow exists separately from the physical universe, so there's a creation that's separated from the creator, and you assume that this is a requirement for religion, which is kind of ridiculous since the vast majority of religions do not even believe that, then why not just put God in the future? just make one radical move. This very Hegelian move. Sort of, let's just say that God was not necessarily needed to create the world, so we can get rid of the creator God. Well, then the question is, why the God word to begin with? Well, the thing is that if the three of us here and some friends of ours and a larger community to gather around us eventually sit down and discuss whatever fantasies we have about the world, what we possibly could achieve in our lives, what we possibly could achieve during our lifetime to pass on to the next generation, there's really only one word for achieving the absolutely highest state possible. And that word is God. We don't have another word for it. So I think the God word is so important. One of my favorite quotes here comes from the French philosopher Quentin Melassu, who said that the concept of God is way too important to leave to the religious. And what he basically meant, he wrote this in 2006. He said that we cannot leave theology as a dying little, thing at the outskirts of academics. Actually, theology should be at the center of everything human beings deal with. And I completely agree with him. So if you take back the God word, the way to credibly do it today, so that even a modern atheist would just have to fall down on his feet and, fall down and kiss your feet and, ask you for mercy, is by saying that, well, if God is the name of something that is still to come, then that's an interesting idea. And that certainly feel with theology should go next, because it also means that futurology and our dreams towards the future and, utopian ideas or whatever would have to somehow be directed and controlled by religion. And that in itself is what religion set out to do originally. So where are we going? It's called the promised land in the Bible. And in this sense, the promised land is just another metaphor for God. So if that's where we're going, if we're going to a new paradigm, say we're going to go towards a new world where digital is everyday, where we have sensocracy around the world, sensors everywhere that control what we do in a way, but also reflect what we do, so the climate can be contained, the planet can be sustainable, we can pass it on to future generations without tons of guilt. If anything of that is possible at all, we have to reinstate religion at the forefront. And that's where Syntheism comes in. We did not invent the term Syntheos. Syntheos is an established theological term, and it basically means the God of creativity, or creativity is God, or the created God, as the opposite of the creator God. So if God is something that we actually take part in creating a technology that eventually becomes God, then that is a good start for discussing Syntheism and syntheology.
Follow-up question. Sorry, Bruce. It's around, when I talked to Jim Rutt recently, I said maybe there's a Dunning-Kruger effect in religion where, it's like people aren't smart enough to know that they're dumb. So the people who identify as religious are very often the least religious people. But then there's this question about what do we gain from identifying religion? Because I think it's in the book too. Most of our ancestors would not have understood what you meant if you asked them what their religion was. It's a fairly recent concept to identify it. And probably still today, people who are maybe neo-pagan in the way they behave, or agnostic or atheist, if we're still saying that they're essentially religious people, whether they know it or not, what do they gain from knowing it? Because you said it's potentially dangerous to not know that you're religious.
Well, I would say that commercialism and irony are not religious. So if you think of religion like, it's about me, and religion is a supermarket, and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to buy the crystals, and I'm going to buy the little handbooks, and I'm going to buy the perfumes, and then I'm going to go home and perform a little ritual and think I'm religious. You're not religious at all. It's a bit like Hollywood stars who show their asses in front of the camera and try to look as sexy as possible and be famous and make millions, and then they thank God at their Oscar speech. It's just like, they're not religious. That's not religion. That's dead religion. We call it dead religion in the Syntheism book. No, real religion today is, for example, to go into a deep, say, sexual or psychedelic experience with somebody you really share tons with. I say sexual because it's usually the opposite gender, and psychedelics usually your own gender. So therefore, we're very tolerant and open here. But I would say to go into, say, an intense emotional state with tons of preparation, and to then integrate it afterwards, and look at it as you've just gone through some kind of transitional experience in your life. You were one person before this, happy one person afterwards. Of course, this is what artists try to do as well. When an artist is really successful, and you go through a theater or you go through a gallery, you have this sort of transformational experience. You come out a different person, not necessarily a better or a worse person, just a different person. And that itself is what you desire in art. That is what religion is all about. Religion to me is about having these truly transformational experiences. And I'm also very anti the idea that you must progress and improve on yourself. That's not religion to me at all. There can be a spiritual practice where you have a certain goal you set out to do, and you want to be a certain person at a certain age. And therefore you go through a spiritual practice or some kind of a spiritual education. That's okay. But religion to me is more about enjoying life to its fullest, but in a profound way, and to give meaning and purpose to your life. Give yourself an archetype, like this is the kind of man or the kind of woman that I am in relation to the community. And I set out to have these religious experiences to enjoy them, but also to be even better at fitting into my archetype and shine as my archetype in the community, to one day pass that on and become a teacher or a mentor of that archetype to younger people. For example, that to me is real religion.
Catherine Keller, polydox process theologian, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she talks about theology as really the privileged place where you can ask the questions in philosophy that you're not allowed to ask in normal philosophy departments, but the really deep questions that we should be wrestling with that somehow get bracketed out of a lot of philosophy departments. But I wanted to ask you, since you were kind of touching on it, we have members of our audience who are likely familiar with Syntheism and others who are not. So you kind of touched on it in your previous answer with Syntheos. Would you be able to just say a little bit about what are the 4 types of theos that you outline in Syntheism?
Yeah, I should just first say that when the Syntheism book came out in 2014, so that's 7 years ago, it took off rapidly in America in 2 distinctly very different areas. One of them was process theology. So I know Catherine. So I was invited to several process theological conferences. And of course, the people who were inspired by Whitehead and Hawthorne and the other guys that came after, they have done process theology throughout the 21st century. They knew right away when the book came along that these guys get it. They're part of our field. They come in with a new voice to add to that whole project of process theology, which was very flattering, and I loved it. And also a lot of sort of naturalist philosophers like Robert Carrington were hooked on the book right when it came out. The other people who loved the book were, of course, the Burning Man people in California. And the year after the book came out, I was asked to speak at the Burning Man World Conference by Larry Harvey personally, and giving that speech, basically describing participatory culture at Burning Man as a religious practice, put tears to the eyes of all these burners. They were just like, yeah, we've been going to Burning Man and we've been going to these other smaller burns around the world for the past 20 years. And we love it. And it's the most meaningful thing in our lives. We met our partners there. We built our families there. That's our lifestyle. But we had no idea that this was actually practiced spirituality. And now, come to think of it, yes, it is. It brings tears to our eyes. It is so damn profound what we're doing. And I just pointed out to them, the Syntheism book says essentially that participatory culture, which is deeply relationalist, which is based on a metaphysics that if you can't create some kind of a communist or Christian utopia, at least you can temporarily create it for 8 days. You can play with the idea and see what it does to you and how fantastic and transformational that experience is. And that's what Burning Man is, if you get fully immersed in it. So what was funny with the Syntheism book, that it both played into the so more theoretical process, theological people in the academic world, and it also played into people who were out there doing participatory culture. And I found that fascinating. I had never dreamt about the reception in America when the book was out. Having said that, though, what we do with the Syntheism book, we don't just write about a God to come or the divine as being participatory culture, but we also write about the history of metaphysics. So we basically lay out that instead of having these sort of drab, boring old Englishmen around who claim to be atheists aggressively and write about selfish genes and shit, you know, just because they were upset that some old priest touched them when they were boys and went to church in England or whatever, they're all fuck ups anyway. They're English, right? So just get them out of the way. Let's have a more a mature discussion on religion and theology and its relationship to philosophy, its relationship to art. And then we basically decided, we wrote the book, that we might as well do metaphysics properly. And metaphysics has always dealt with basically 3 things. One of them is the universe or the world, including everything that exists and how it relates to everything else. the world all, so to speak. We call that pantheos. We get the term pantheism from that. So if you think that the universe and God are one and the same thing, you're a pantheist. Okay, but then we also take atheos seriously. Atheos, the God who exists through his non-existence. So non-existence as the divine. And that's a very interesting concept. It's very Hegelian. But what it says is that whenever there is a negation, wherever there's a lack, wherever there's a void, that lack or that void has to be filled. And movement and process starts with negations. It starts with something that isn't there. And that is a very good way to do metaphysics as well. So it's just like, for example, you say, I want to be a deeply serious, profoundly religious person. That's a desire I have in my life. I want to crack a joke now and then too, but I want to be a religious person. I want to take religion seriously. Now, if you devote yourself to that, you will discover very early on that the first thing you will do is to look at the world like, what is lacking? For example, why is data lacking about the climate? So we don't even know how the climate actually operates. Because if we're going to solve the problem with climate change, or at least minimize the cost involved with climate change, then we must know much more about the world. That's a negation and data lacking. For example, you decide to go out to help people who suffer. Well, they can suffer from mental disease. They can suffer from starvation. They can suffer from not having a home. You will discover that these people lack things. There are lacks there. You can then build a whole metaphysics based on that. Christianity did that, for example, or Buddhism did that. There's suffering in the world. And what can we do about the suffering? How can we get over the suffering, overcome it, or whatever could we do? Those are negations. So you can build an entire system of metaphysics, understanding the world, including physics, chemistry, biology, from negations. That's what Hegel did with his philosophy. The third one is basically to realize that there's difference. And this reminds us of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who early in the 20th century said that why are philosophers constantly obsessed? But why is there something rather than nothing? Leibniz's own question, all the way from Leibniz up to Heidegger. Philosophers obsessed with this question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And Bergson said, that's not the most interesting question if you're a philosopher. The most interesting question is, why is there so much of everything? Which I agree with. Gilles Deleuze agreed with that too and said, of course, the philosophically most interesting question is, why is there so much diversity in the world? Why is there so much difference? And then you can build an entire worldview, a metaphysical system on the fact that there's so much difference and how can you understand difference? And when you try to compare biology and physics, and why you try to compare mind and matter, you're constantly dealing with these masses of information and enormous complexities. And if you think that's the most interesting thing in the world, you can create a metaphysics based on difference. Now, all the metaphysical history, dating back to before we started writing, have dealt with these three different major areas of metaphysics. Now we're adding a fourth one. And the fourth one we're adding, which is syntheism, we have pantheos for the universe as a whole. We have, or non-duality, as you say in the East. We have atheos for negation and the principle of negation as a starting point. And we have entheos, as we say, entheos, like the God from within. When we talk about complexity, and we talk about from within in the sense that when we look at ourselves on the inside, we look at our own brains and our own minds, that's where just diversity explodes, right? So that's a good place to start with the entheos, the enterprise entheos. The fourth one that we add in the book is syntheos. And we're basically saying that we can also talk about something that is yet to come and has not yet happened. And in that case, it is the relationship between human beings and technology that is the most interesting one, because we obviously live in nature, we realize that what really changes the world and changes us in that process is technological change. So where's this technology heading? Well, maybe the technology all along wanted to create itself into God and just used us human beings as stupid little idiots to run its errands, to be the slaves of that God who one day will come to exist. Well, it's just a game that's interesting to play with.
A lot of things in there that I like. I love that atheos is in the mix. I like the way you describe it, because I've often argued that no God should be considered one of the names of God, especially for people who say, well, no God created the universe and no God organizes our lives. They're really naming an ultimate factor. I also love that you bring Robert Corrington up, because I think he's very underappreciated. He's the author of probably my favorite book on Wilhelm Reich. And when I think about Reich, I think about pleasure and desire and the role that Eros plays in organizing our lives and our version of the cosmos. And that comes up in the book. So I wonder if you'd say something a little bit about how you conceive the relationship between drive and desire, but also the role you think desire plays in making a coherent image of reality.
Oh, yeah. In the following book, Digital Libido, we're actually writing a trilogy called the Grand Narrative Trilogy. So John Söderqvist and I are really exploring narratives, like what kind of stories do human beings tell about ourselves and the world? And their pathos, their logos, their mythos, etc. So we're working on the third and last part, which is going to come out in 2022, called Process and Event. It's going to lead to that book. The second book is called Digital Libido. And in Digital Libido, we approach the idea of drive and desire. So in classical psychoanalysis, say Freud or Lacan or Jung, you deal with drive and desires to distinctly different things. Like drive is just there. It's almost mechanical. It just pursues what it wants, right? Whereas desire is always oriented towards different objects of desire. And it's a linguistic game that we human beings uniquely play. But when Söderqvist and I looked into it, we said that this is kind of narrowing it down a bit too much. It is easier these days for human beings to understand ourselves both as biological beings and as cultural beings. There's a part of us that is animalistic, and we don't mind to talk about that any longer. There's also a part of us that isn't animalistic at all. And there's possibly, potentially, also something divine, a divine spark inside of us. And none of this exists in Lacan, for example, in Jacques Lacan's psychoanalysis. I would say Lacan's weakness is that he never really discusses what an analysand or a patient going to Lacan would do if they've successfully gone through the psychoanalysis and therefore have gone through the transformation and have achieved a kind of enlightenment. So he would call that psychoanalytical enlightenment. He never wants to discuss that. It's like he would be very uncomfortable with it, or he just leaves his students to argue over once he's dead. But there's no transcendence there. And we started looking at transcendence, like we all talk about purpose and meaning as human beings. And purpose and meaning, we would clearly define as something very different than just desiring a certain object. So desiring a certain object can be sexual, for example, or it can just be like women love shoes and men love cars or whatever. But, you know, we desire certain objects, but we've not include transcendence in that. Transcendence is never an object of anything. It's rather something that is bigger than ourselves and therefore also survives us. For example, you say you got kids, you want what's good for your kids, and you do expect to die before your kids die, and you do expect to pass on a heritage to your children. Well, that heritage is part of transcendence. And the fact that there's a drive that wants you to transcend yourself, and that purpose and meaning can only come out of that, is in itself a drive. So we need to add transcendence to drive and desire. And while we're doing it, why not also add instinct prior to it? Because instinct is something Lacan says, that's not too important to psychoanalysis. We can just ignore that. I don't believe that at all. So what we're doing in Digital Libido is saying that there are 4 different drives that we should separate to understand our drives and desires better. And instinct is the animalistic part inside of us. So what we share with animals, essentially, we can refer to as instinct. And that includes the first thing we do in life, which is that we crawl up to hit our mother's breast and start sucking it, the first thing we do when we're born. That's completely instinctual. So instinct is something we're born with. The first thing we do in life is that we operate through instinct, as any animal does. Then there comes pure drive, drive as drive, and that's just mechanical. And I think Lacan describes it really well. Psychoanalysis has gone into drive really well, so that can be understood through psychoanalysis. The third one is desire, which is what is human about us. And we are linguistic creatures. We talk to each other all the time. We write to each other all the time. And all these scribblings and all these chats we have with one another also create a separation from the world, but it creates a symbolic universe. And this sort of symbolic or semiotic universe that we create for ourselves through language is where we put our desires. And the best way to describe desire is that it's always something that escapes you. So you really want that apple. You finally get that apple. When you bite that apple, you already want another pear or something like that. You know, you don't want the apple any longer. Desire always wants to maintain itself. That's fundamental to desire. But then there's also transcendence. And that's exactly why Lacan and most of the psychoanalysts always ended up as sort of atheistic nihilists. You know, they weren't too interested in theology or religion. but they should have been. And I think when you bring theology into psychoanalysis, you will have to arrive to the conclusion that transcendence is the divine spark in human beings. It's what gives us purpose and meaning in life. And without transcendence, we're not human. So transcendence is what I would call the divine drive inside of us.
I'm interested in your notion of individual and its relationship to the syntheist agent. And I just wanted to relate that to some of my own thinking in that area, and then ask for your riff on that. I've drawn on Latour's notion of irreduction, but I've played with that a little bit. And so my suggestion is that we are infinitely divisible, infinitely reducible. And in that infinite reducibility or divisibility, we are therefore individual or indivisible or irreducible, because there's always a ungraspable there that yields to the division. And so I call such an entity a wild knot. You can't find the there apart from the relation. There's an infinite divisibility, but in that infinite yield, there's a indivisibility, you can say. So yeah, I'd like to just hear your thoughts on that, and on how you conceive of the individual and the syntheist agent.
Well, what you were describing there was anything but an individual. Individual means it cannot be divided. And if we're looking at something that's irreducible, then individual is the wrong word. And this has a really good advantage, is that people get really upset when you say you don't believe in individualism. Well, that's because individualism has been the religion that we tried to replace Christianity with in the West, following René Descartes, and especially Immanuel Kant's amazing work in the 18th century. But Immanuel Kant set out what we would today call the modern Western individual. Now, I don't believe in individualism for the simple reasons that I'm not talking to polar bears. I'm talking to human beings. Polar bears are, by birth, solitary animals. Okay, they live on their own the entire lives. And except for fucking somebody, if I may say so, sometime, and getting a little pup, they really don't care about meeting anybody else. So they would love to be isolated with Zoom during the coronavirus. Polar bears would love it. They're deeply solitary animals. We're not. Human beings are not. Human beings are actually incredibly social animals. We're very, very dependent on the flock. And therefore, philosophy should really start, since it's addressing humans, it should really start with asking ourselves the question, what kind of flocks or swarms or lynch mobs or exoduses or nations or tribes or clans or families do we human beings create, and why? So I think religion's most important question to address today is that what kind of communities or communitas can we create today that makes sense to human beings, but also works in the sort of highly technological environment we undoubtedly live within today. So that, I think, should be religion's first question. And this is the great thing with the word religion. It comes from the old Latin word religare, which means what connects people. It has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with how we connect with one another. Then the question of what God is, or the God word, is a theological matter. That's theology, that's not religion. Religion itself does not need a theos to operate. It just needs, or the theos can be the community itself. For example, the idea of the Holy Spirit in Christianity is really that the congregation in itself is an expression of the divine, which is a great idea, by the way. So I go back to the word tribe. I think that everything that humans do starts as a tribal poiesis, not as an autopoiesis. It doesn't start from out of nowhere and suddenly self-organizes. No, anything human beings do, tribe organizes. So the first thing is that anything that makes sense to us human beings, that we hang on to and that we start working with or start exploring, anything that catches our phenomenological attention, usually has to do with something tribal. Like, this is tribal. Is it my tribe or some other tribe? Is it good for my tribe or bad for my tribe? How do I incorporate this and turn it into something that's good for my tribe? How do I put it inside the membrane of my tribe or my community to make it something meaningful that I can be proud of? Okay, those are deeply human questions to me. And so since we are social, that means we are individuals. We're divided in the social sphere. We are many people in one. But also when we look at ourselves, I started working with schizoanalysis in the 1970s. I was inspired by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. And I started exploring those techniques. And it turned out when I took them to Burning Man at these festivals and gave people the possibility to explore schizoanalysis and basically taught them, why are you just one person? You can be 12 people. What? You can be 12 people. They can have different genders. They can have different ages. They can have different personalities. And basically, yourself is nothing but the board meeting. And at the end of the board meeting, the board has to decide what your body is going to do. If your tongue is going to be twisted a certain way, if you're going to put your feet in a certain mode or whatever. But whatever you do as an activity in your life will be some kind of a majority decision board meeting thing. And that is always afterwards constructed as yourself. So the self is only the last little thing we add to a process where a lot of different drives and desires and different personalities and different forces inside ourselves and external to us are interacting one another in a really complex relationalist pattern. And to understand yourself this way is so much more creative and interesting than to think of yourself as an individual who's undivided and who must always pursue it, hunt to find yourself somehow and then declare yourself to the world in a world of 8 billion other atomic individuals who are busy declaring who they are all the time. And you basically get trolling on the internet in response to that. So I think individualism is dying. It's dying screaming with the internet today. We're sick and tired of it. And we're always looking for people now who add a tribal value to what they do. So we're looking for people who can add a tribal value to our own process and to our own products that we're involved with. That's what we're looking for today. And I think we're deeply tribal.
Yeah, I really love that. And I'll just add a quick follow-up on that, which is I agree with your use of individual rather than individual. I use wild not to suggest the ongoing agency of something that always extends into relation. You know, Sloterdijk, he says, a person is always at least two, never just a one. But I like the notion of something like wild not, which actually points to the infinite relatedness and dependency that any of us is just a node for. You know, that we show up at. There's tribe there, there's earth there, there's cosmos there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Sloterdijk, because he wrote a book called After God at about the same time that we released the Syntheism book. So his thinking is almost parallel to ours and yours. So yeah.
Great.
I think of the individual question from sort of three angles. You know, the first is the one Bruce is mentioning here of, you know, are there ways of discussing the infinitesimal regression of relational difference as the root of identity in a way that we might call individuality? That's an interesting question. Another interesting question is I think of it as Gurdjieffian, which is sort of the syntheism within the person, which is to say you are an intrapsychic community, but your potential individuality is something that you can work on creating by generating more harmony and integration among these parts, getting a more cohesive internal community. And you have this horizon, this ever receding possibility of the integration of your internal community to a higher degree of cohesion. But then there's this other part, which is I think the more obvious part, which is we've suffered from a cultural ethical ideal of individuality. And we have to recognize our embeddedness and our relationality. And we have to foreground that in the notion of our identity and agency in order to have a better way of living. So those are the three parts I see around that question. But I think what I want to ask is, you know, like we mentioned earlier, we were talking about whether this is going to be for the Future of Religion series or for the Meta Theory series. And that relates a little bit to whether we're talking mostly about the content of Syntheism or about the kind of thinking that goes into Syntheism. So I want to ask a little bit about that, about you. Like, what do you think it is in yourself that makes you really interested in bringing a whole bunch of domains together? And what is it that makes you capable of doing that? Because technology, economics, philosophy, religion, time, psychology, biology, they're all in this mix, and something drives you in particular and gives you the ability to bring all those things together and to keep feeling that you have to bring all these things together, and which I have that feeling too. So I'm curious about it.
Oh yeah, I get that. So it's funny because if you remove the word individual from your vocabulary, like you remove the word Negro and you say the N word, I call it the I word, it works. I can talk to anybody as individual. People make sense of the word individual. They don't seem to miss it. And then I can add Bruno Latour's, thank you for pointing out Latour here, Bruce. I can add his term agent, which is also used by Karen Barad, for example. Many other philosophers prefer to use the word agent, because the individual as we know it really starts with somebody yelling at us before we even know about these things. You know, we're a little baby screaming, we just want the tit all the time. And somebody points out and says, you there. And there's an internalization of the you accusation. That is the beginning of the, oh, me? Okay, so it's first a very passive reaction to something. Oh, me? Me? What? Me? Where's mother? You know, am I different from mother? Okay, that's where psychoanalysis starts. So it's actually an attack on you. Individuality is an attack on you. And I think historical individualism, which is very specific for the West, and it follows after the Enlightenment in the 17th century, it's still not, it's like my friends in India and China, they don't get always obsessed with individualism in the West, especially Americans. Just like, that's like an historical anomaly to them. And I found that very interesting because I think individualism, as we know it, was really developed in the relationship to the power structure of the nation state. And the nation state was run by making us all responsible for the actions that we did. And if you're going to run a court of law in a nation state, you invent a term, you call it citizen. And you then say you're going to give the citizen certain rights and freedoms, and you speak highly about the citizen. You have a long pantheon of philosophers who claim that individualism is a kind of freedom, you know, it's creativity, it's fantastic. But in reality, the nation states really creates these citizens to hold us responsible for what we do, so they can lock us up or do whatever they want with us and tax us heavily, whatever they want to do. So I think the story of individualism has to be retold from the perspective of that this was forced on us. And we never really needed it. We did not need it. The three of us did not need it. I'm thinking, for example, this conversation as the central thing here. I'm thinking the relation here is what exists. I'm thinking that Bruce and Layman and Alexander will probably eventually have to turn down their computers and go off and cook food and see other people because we're located in 3 different countries at the moment. But we are just the byproducts of that relation. And once you start seeing your interactions with other human beings, like, oh, the me you're talking about, or the sense of self I have, or, you know, these chaos of different people who live in a house called Alexander, this wonderful chaos inside of me, it's just a chaos that, because there's a body attached to it, is giving a certain agency by my friends. So when, for example, the 3 of us agree that Bruce is forced to do the edit of this conversation afterwards before he puts it online, but then Layman and Alexander will help push it through their social media platforms, we just divide responsibility between us when we collaborate, and that's giving each other agency. And the word agency works, and individual works. And when I use those 2 terms, I don't need the word individual any longer, and I'm out. Okay. That brings me to the question of, why do I write books? I never work solo. My life is very monkish, believe me. I love monasteries. I love studying. I love reading. I love thinking. I love playing around with ideas. These days, you webcast and you podcast your ideas before you even write them, which is wonderful because you can involve more people in the conversation. But all of these things are social. And I write my books with Jan. And what John and I basically do is that before we write a new book, we just sit down together in his big villa in Italy and have a glass of red wine and, you know, some canapes or whatever. You know, the better your life is, the darker your book will be. I used to be a songwriter. I always remember that I was happy, I wrote the sad songs. When I was sad, I wrote the happy songs. You know, it's like you always compensate in your mind for your surroundings. So we live a good life in a villa in Italy when I'm together with Jan. And we just sit down in his villa and we say, let's look at the map. Let's roll out the world map. Let's roll out the world map of all philosophers that we know of anywhere in the world and see what they do. And then just let's try to find what the 2 of us are best positioned to contribute to the overall discourse of philosophy. What exactly could we do that we would do better than anybody else, judging from the position, from the cultural background, from the traveling and reading experiences we had, from all the studies we've done, what we did in the past, judging from our own self-confidence, what will we judge would be the best thing we would do? And when we started writing the Grand Narrative trilogy, we've written another trilogy called the Futurica trilogy before that, which was all about the relationship between man and technology. So we decided to write another trilogy, and John had previously been a scriptwriter. He wrote movie scripts. I've been a music producer. We were both culturally involved. We've both been artistic in the past before we decided to become philosophers and write these books. And we just thought we were always interested in narratives. And everything human beings do is narratives. So we supposedly have a logical narrative. We call it mathematics or science. We have a mythical narrative, which is the kind of stories we tell about ourselves and our community. And we have a pathical narrative, which is like all the things we don't want our children to get involved with and want to hide from their eyes before they grow up. So that includes like sex and violence, things like that. It's a pathical narrative. And these three different types, groups of narratives, pathos and logos and mythos, are things that interest both me and John. We're like equally interested in all three. We work with, we live with all three our entire lives, you know, and hey, we're 60 years old and still horny as hell. We have to deal with that every day, John and I, you know, we congratulate each other on our love lives and things. But we live life to its fullest, both Jan and I. And so we are pathical too. And we just decided maybe it's not that we're best at pathos or logos or mythos. Maybe we are best really at combining the three and create a dialectical relationship between the three and then write a trilogy about that. And we just thought, okay, that means we have to do theology. Wow, let's do theology. Okay, to do technology even deeper, we have to go theological on technology. Well, nobody's done that. Let's do that. And that's how we started exploring the many different areas that we touch upon in our work. And we are, of course, what you would call generalists in that sense. We don't claim to be specialists. We are working with specialists in every area that we touch. If we do psychology, we call the best damn psychology professors in the world. We talk to them, you know. If we're going to do science like physics, then I went to CERN in Switzerland and I found a physics mentor who taught me everything about physics and cosmology and how to build quantum computers and everything they do today. So I could understand that as best as I possibly could. And that's how Jan and I work. And then we put all of that together into what is essentially a meta-narrative. A narrative on narratives, which is what this trilogy is all about.
You mentioned in there your work reflecting on technology and the internet, and I think that's a really big part of both your books prior to this emerging trilogy and also, you know, in this emerging trilogy. Jeremy Rifkin says that he believes the internet age is going to help usher in a civilization, a compassionate or empathic civilization. And, you know, I think right now, especially around in the US and any of those affected by our unfortunate politics at present, you know, we've had a lot of division and polarization, which has been, you know, magnified by internet and social media. But I do feel that, you know, Jeremy, and I think you are nevertheless pointing to a future horizon of possibility for a networked society and an internet world for a different kind of civilization. So I want to throw in one little sub-component there, which is, you know, Alastair McIntyre refers to us as dependent rational animals. I wouldn't probably limit it only to rational, but he says that we are, right, you know, we are first dependent, and any kind of independence we have is only won through the networks of dependence, and any morality is built on the recognition of interdependence. So he says that we need, in that kind of, again, in recognizing those dynamics, our vulnerability, our weakness, our dependence, our interrelatedness, we need to come up with new ways of living. We need a new Benedict, a new person to give us kind of the rule for community, in a sense, and in a broad sense. So my kind of dual question is, what do you see as the potential of a networked society in an internet age for fostering a new way of being? And what's your sense of kind of the rule of community that can emerge from that?
Yeah, let's not jump to the peace process too quickly, okay? I don't think there's any polarization out there that wasn't there already. I think it's just become obvious because it's been given a voice, for good or bad. What the internet really will do, it has almost not even started yet, but what digital ultimately will do, and I would refer here to Mark Stallman, who's one of the one of Marshall McLuhan's best disciples in Canada, by the way, and Stallman taught me this already in the 1990s. He said that when digital finally arrives, because he cannot forget anything and because all the data will be stored forever at no cost, it means that there'll be a radical new truth to human existence. And what is colliding today is the fact that we realize that everything will be out in the open sooner or later. We wrote about this in our first book, The Netocrats, 21 years ago. And this will then create, because we have an ideal transparency, we even have a call to transparency that actually Christianity and Islam are the two religions. These are the two religions that share the call to transparency, like everything should be out in the open. The connection with God must be direct between the believer and God. This is something that Islam and Christianity share. And it's totally alien to Eastern thinking, by the way. It's also alien to Jewish thinking, to be honest about it. And I think the collision of the call to transparency with digital now remembering absolutely everything that happened is exactly what took us to the almost apocalyptic point we're at right now. And I don't think the culture war is over by far. I think it's only gotten started. It will get more complex. There will be several different culture wars going on. And in Digital Libido, we said we're going to expect at least the next 50 years are going to be very, very messy. We call it a dark renaissance because it's also artistically going to be a gold mine to work with, right? But I think for most people, it will be very messy over the next 50 years or so. And this is only the beginning because the call to transparency cannot hold. We're working with this in the new book, Process and Event. We're saying that we have to reinstate something called the barred absolute. And that's not barred like in my name. This is B-A-R-R-E-D, like the barred absolute, like an absolute that is banned. We cannot get inside of it, meaning that the fact that you're a child and you're not an adult yet means that adulthood is a barred absolute to you. The tons of shit that adult people do you must not know about yet because you're not ready to understand it. It would be traumatic for you to experience this, that you wouldn't get it. So you have to wait until a certain age before you're ready for it. Now, the same thing goes with being a grown-up or an adult. All cultures have had a barred absolute even for grown-ups, saying that there are certain things that only elders or the priests or people who are truly experienced and are ready for it and have the right personality for it are ready to experience. And they can then do that. And that included talking to the gods. We went to see the shamans outside of the community because they were the only ones who talked to other tribes that are going to war with them. That I call horizontal communication with the outside world. But the shamans also took care of the vertical communication with the outside world. They talked to the gods on our behalf. And when Christianity tried to eliminate that, Catholicism realized they had to reinstate it, and that's called sainthood. So the Catholics can go and talk to a saint, and then the saint can talk to God on their behalf. We don't talk directly to God in any culture because we don't go beyond the barred absolute. We don't go beyond before what we're ready to do. In Eastern thinking, this is different between Sutra and Tantra. And I firmly believe we have to reinstall the barred absolute. We need to close down certain things like this is not for public consumption. This is not meant to be out there in the open. I think it would be very, very valuable for people going forward to be able to live within a community where you keep your mouth shut to the outside world about what you're doing within that community. That's what we're doing in philosophy of membranics today. What does it mean to build a membrane around your community? And what does it mean to keep that membrane safe and sound and protected at all times so information doesn't leak out and destroy the community itself? All of these things have to be addressed philosophically, theologically, spiritually. It's a long journey that we need to do because we're leaving an old paradigm, the capitalist age, where the call to transparency dominated media. That was called mass media at the time, and it was very controlled, by the way. Now mass media is dead. Politics is dead. We wrote in the Netocrats in the year 2000 that because politics is dying, it will go ironic. When it goes into its death stage, when it goes ironic, America is very likely to elect a reality TV show star as president, which is what happened in 2016. And Donald Trump wasn't even the president of the United States. He basically took his TV show into the White House and hired Nancy Pelosi as the evil witch for 4 years because politics is over. At the end of the day, is there a difference between Trump and Biden? Probably not. It's all theatrical, right? So a lot of the polarizations we talk about that we find so problematic and we can't find unity. Well, maybe you shouldn't have unity in society with the enormous class differences that America has. If you're wealthy in America, you're incredibly wealthy. And if you're poor, you're dirt poor. Now, if that is within one and the same nation under one of the same flag, America has a few problems it needs to address before it starts dismissing polarization as a problem. So I think it's healthy in that sense. But remember that digital will remember absolutely everything that happens. And when my friends tell me, well, I go offline nowadays and I turn off my computer and I go out in nature and you don't think the satellites are looking after you there, you can no longer go offline. The internet is now a god that is a global phenomenon that is picking up data everywhere around the world. And the data is just increasing in size, and the processing power is increasing all the time, meaning that we're moving into a sensocracy of sensors that control and regulate the world, whether we like it or not. And we probably have to, because as human beings, democratic voters, voting for the president who promises to give us what we want, climate change will happen in a dramatic way. Atomic bombs will proliferate around the planet and we will go down. We can't afford that. So I think you'll welcome this sensocracy. I think you will welcome informationalism. I think there'll be a brutal new kind of truth to everything we do. It will kill advertising and marketing. Thank God. We always hated it because we now refer to that as spam. You know, the advertising industry hates me and Söderqvist for a good reason. We're set to kill them. But people will anyway, because the algorithms will get rid of all the advertising and the sales pitches and all that shit. So there's a brutal truth more than empathy to the future. But I think the fact that human beings are empathic, we were empathic all along. We haven't become more or less empathic. And I don't think empathy is the problem here. I think addressing the enormous differences in potential between human beings is the real issue. Yeah, so that means spreading Wi-Fi across the planet, make it freely available for most people, then get them proper educations and give everybody a chance in a meritocratic system is the best we can do.
Two things on my mind. First is checking in with the fact that we're doing all the questioning and you're doing the answering. So I'm going to remind us that you can ask questions too if you want to. The second thing is I've got Nietzsche on my mind, and every few years as my own thinking evolves, I go back and read Nietzsche, and whatever I've been thinking about, I can usually find it in there. He just explored so many pathways and danced around in so many areas. And when I look at it, there's always a tension in me between looking at where his thought is limited or reinterpreting his thought so that it includes the new thing I was thinking about. And I find I'm able to do either with him, partly because he just brought so much ambiguity and complexity to his writing style. But I'm curious where you think he's limited, where you think, for example, the will to power is an insufficient but very promising concept.
Oh, I love will to power. The way we were both Nietzscheans, obviously, right? And I would say the problem is not that Nietzsche is wrong. The problem is that we have too little Nietzsche in our society today. I think of the three stories we tell about ourselves, we constantly focus on logos and mythos. You know, it's between Stanford and Netflix in a way. And pathos is what's forgotten about. I think that actually is creating a really dangerous, strong undercurrent in contemporary society. I could definitely see fascism and anarchism and all kinds of isms rise in different forms in the next 20 years because there's a strong pathical urge underneath that people don't want to deal with. So I think Nietzsche is the guy who does deal with that. But I would love to add to Nietzsche that will to power, I would say, needs to be divided. Because the phallus is always divided in cultures. If you study Eastern philosophy, and I'm sure you have, then you know that the phallus is divided between the king and the priest. So the king or the chieftain symbolizes the future and is the will to transcendence. And the priest symbolizes the support to that project, which is the will to intelligence. And in this is what AI does today and what computers do today is that they're taking over the priestly function and they're supporting our human activities by getting all the data in, processing the data, basically deliver a correct worldview. We can finally predict weather for the next 3 weeks. We couldn't predict weather for 3 hours 20 years ago. All these revolutions that have gone to the moment are priestly when you think about them in the will to power sense. So I said, well, will to power doesn't have the division between the will to intelligence, which is that I want to gather information and make the decisions we make for the future as wise as possible. And the other one is will to transcendence. Well, I want to personify the guy who acts on that information, who becomes truth, who personifies truth and goes out in the world with truth as an act. So I think will to power should be divided to be truly understood. That would be to give Nietzsche honor, I think. And the other one is that the Dionysian today has to be split as well. Nietzsche talks about the Apollonian, Dionysian. This is, again, the Apollonian here is usually perceived as logos, and the Dionysian is perceived as pathos. And when we try to unite the two or balance them, we create mythical narratives that are really about how it's impossible to sustain a balance between the two, but we have to deal with them all the time. But there's also another really dark force going at the moment that a lot of Russians have pointed out. Dogin, for example, has pointed out, it's the Cybele. The Cybele rarely occurs in culture, but it occurs right now. And Cybele was this Greek goddess who fell in love with her son. And because she couldn't have sex with her son, they castrated the son and he became a eunuch. And she's like this woman who can no longer contain herself. So she's like a witch who can't contain herself, having this army of eunuchs coming behind her. And I see a lot of the things going on at the moment, like woke culture, for example, which is a very sort of victimhood worshipping, sort of castrated kind of culture, a counterculture, are signs of the times that the Sabellian has come forward today. And that is like bad pathos. That's like really dark pathos. And there's a lot of it in culture today. People are incredibly frustrated. And that has to be responded to properly and understood better. And so I think, again, love Nietzsche. And please explain to us how a Nietzschean ends up in northern British Columbia. I mean, it's incredibly Nietzschean itself, you know?
It was interesting. When I went to university, all my first year courses bored me. And I had one third year course I took in the first year, which was existentialism. And it mostly bored me with the exception of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And I still have these two little collected volumes of them because I just became absolutely addicted to it. It was so much fun in it. It's a bit like Shakespeare to me, where people think they like Shakespeare, but they don't laugh at the plays, right? Nietzsche to me is so funny and so lighthearted and dances. He reminds me of Groucho Marx sword fighting or something like that. There's such a lightness of being, and he discusses the lightness. And when you see these pictures on the covers of old Nietzsche books of like a lone individual in the mountains pondering the dark mysteries of existence, that's not the Nietzsche feeling at all. That's not the Dionysian. It's just so much pleasure in it. How could one turn away from it?
Yeah, it's like Nietzsche is the real Oscar Wilde. But you're right. It's like when you read Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, you're a bit like, are these guys are they very clever? Or do they write so damn well that I'm tempted to think they're more clever than they are? And then you realize they are this clever and they write this well. And it's kind of, okay, I will never write that well, you know, but thank God philosophy is full of great thinkers who write terribly. And at the end of the day, what counts philosophically is actually the arguments. But Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, I understand your love of them and I share it completely. They were, yeah. Love at first word, you know, for me too, when I read them. Yeah, absolutely. And Nietzsche, I think, is more important than ever. And to understand the human condition, it's back to Nietzsche, definitely. To understand the thinking that is required to understand the current paradigm shift and the complexity of our society today, I think takes Hegel. That's how I used to do. But please, there's a lot of people who come to this conversation because they followed me. They've heard my arguments before as well. So I want to hear more about you guys and what you're up to. And especially, what have you done during the Corona year? Because I wrote this last paper you published, Layman. And I thought it was terrific. So introduce yourself to my European audience. Let's start there.
Layman Pascal, Canadian. Somehow I've gotten roped into the integral community, and now I'm sort of straddling the meta-modern and game B and integral communities. Over the last year and a half, Bruce and I started doing this interview series, which was first originally just people presenting their ideas. And then it started to become a dialogue series. And then because there's so much to do, I took over the talking part for most of the time, and Bruce is doing the production part. And now we're sitting in a position where arguably we've had more conversations, or as many conversations with the different types of people in these higher discourse communities than almost anybody else. So we're getting a real sense of what the overview of the land is. And for me, a lot of the motivation is that internally, I feel like I want to take all the different flavors of all the different types of people who are pressing into this same thought space and mix them in myself. So the energetic and emotional hybridization of my own feelings is what I'm really excited about. I always say I used to be a meditation and yoga teacher, and spirituality was my focus for a long time. And I was, almost completely outside of society, like a mendicant monk for many years. And only in the last 5 to 10 have I even started to, interface with the official society I live in. I grew up and spent most of my life in BC. I've lived internationally a little bit, met a wonderful woman who drew me out to live in Ontario. And whoa, where did Bruce go?
You could go on. He'll probably rejoin us. I'm sure.
All right.
Yeah, it's still recording. So
yeah, this last year has been great for me personally, because the people I most want to talk to are in the house. We've put a lot more attention into regularity of sexuality as a religious practice. I've been able to put a lot more time into the yard and the house. The schedule of international conversations with other people who I think are at the leading edge of the new thought space, that's gone way up for me. I love it. And politics, both as a spectator analyst and as a commentator, has become much more important to me in terms of using the analytic tools that are provided in these communities to try to get deeper insights into the political conversation and to see where we need to go outside of the normal dualities that are presented as our options.
And how is that political discourse difference for you in Canada compared to the United States?
Well, it's interesting to be in Canada because you have this distance, but also your media space is filled up by the Americans. So most of us spend more time watching American politics than Canadian politics by far. And over the course of the last year, one of the things you get is, whatever the balance of socialism and capitalism that we've got compared to what they've got, we're doing a lot better. Our people are happier. We got those survival checks monthly, not once. The general sensibility is much better. And so one of the things it means for me is we need to stop thinking in terms of like, did capitalism replace regressive medieval socialism, or is socialism the answer to the problems of capitalism and we have to get beyond capitalism? For me, the modernist frame, the modernist economic paradigm is always a balance of socialism and capitalism. The question is, how do you get that balance right for whatever the technological and environmental situations are at the moment? So obviously, I think the Americans need to bring up the socialism component right now to get on top of the situation. But I think you need to do that in order to stabilize the society and the economy. And then that's when you can think about, well, how can we really change this? How can we get the numbers that we use for exchanges differently? What other kinds of dimensions can we bring into this? What are the basic underlying assumptions of how we calculate value? And because we need to harness the collective emergent intelligence of the market, right? There's always going to be an invisible hand, and we have to be smart about the invisible hand. There's always going to be these competitive drives. We need to be smart about how we use that for general well-being. And that means we need to rethink the basic software of the economy, but I don't think we can jump right to that. You've got to stabilize your socialism, capitalism balance in a way that makes things pretty good for your people and is ready for the hits that are coming, because hits are coming, right? It's not just
that really state versus market, instead of having these old term capitalism and socialism. And instead of talking about socialism in America, you talk about taxation, because that's what they're concerned with, right? So if I pay taxes, where does that money go? And of course, there's infrastructure investments that are desperately needed, especially in America. Canada's probably better off. And that's what the state does better than the market, undeniably so. So this discussion should have been over and done with by now. We should have settled for the fact that we arrived at sort of a state market balance, which is more like a political issue, than talk about socialism or capitalism all the time. It's just a very tiresome debate that Americans bring everybody back to, all the rest of the world would love to ignore it. Other than that, Canada has a very good reputation in Europe, so you know. We think of Canadians as free people who can smoke weed when they like, and you're a lot better looking than Americans. You're not as obese as they are. This is also why you die less from corona than they do. That's basically the European perception. And I think there's also growing perception in Europe that people are leaving California and New York, and that the idea that Los Angeles and New York represented America is dying. And we think of Colorado and Texas and Canada as the place where people go and where the culturally most interesting things are happening in North America. So that could be
the cannabis thing is fascinating because we essentially legalized it right before Corona. So people went from it was illegal to it's a required service protected by the state now. So like just before the lockdown, the government said, well, your ability to access cannabis stores, that's an essential service now, like your ability to access the grocery stores. So 2 years ago, it was a crime, and now it's a protected service.
Well, if you get rid of the war on drugs, the Third World War would finally be over, and that would make a hell of a difference to all of the Americas, to be honest about it. So that's a massive tragedy of our times. The war on drugs is still running. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So, but I mean, you talk about here metamodernism, and integral, which obviously is the heritage from Ken Wilber coming out of Boulder, Colorado, and also game B theory. So can you explain to my followers as well what you mean with these terms and where they're at? It's not that people aren't familiar here. We have loads of people who are into metamodernism in Europe, and they're certainly interested in game B theory and things like that. And especially, of course, we have Wilberians all over Europe as well. But I would love to hear, since there have been so many great conversations through webcasts and podcasts over the last year, there's been a lot of papers being published, and finally, a lot of people who would love to be monks and nuns have had the chance to be monks and nuns, digital versions of that the last year. But where is this entire discourse moving that the two of you personify so much?
Well, let me touch on the what those communities are very briefly, and then I'll pass it off to Bruce, who's now wonderfully come back to us. There's a sort of meta view of the world that's developmentally oriented and trying to get beyond the different versions of the traditional civilization pattern that we've been undergoing through all of history. And I see them as sort of natural leanings, right? There's a game B community, and it leans a little bit more technological. There's a lot of people very interested there in how we assimilate networks, how we make new systems, how we deal with complexity theory. Right. So these people grew out of sort of the Santa Fe Institute, Jim Rutt and Jordan Hall. Brett Weinstein was deep in there. These are people who are trying to look very scientifically and often very technologically at how we get beyond the entire pattern of human history and incorporate all of our new insights. Now, the meta-modern community is looking at the same problems, the same space, coming up with a lot of the same solutions, but they lean much more toward the sociological dimension. They're much more interested, I think, in the politics and the sociology, things like that. And then the integral community, which is got a huge boost from Ken Wilber and has now gone much beyond him, but also has a history before him. It leans a lot more toward the psychological and spiritual aspect of those things. So even though all of those components are in all of those things, you find spirituality in metamodernism, and there's a lot of concern in integral theory about what we call the lower right quadrant, which is systems and politics and things like that. Nonetheless, these communities are, I think, complementary, slightly different emphases around the same general thought space and the same general set of challenges we have to solve. And I think they're coming up with largely the same types of solutions, which simply are the solutions in that problem space. What do you think, Bruce?
Yeah, glad to be back from the dead. I don't know what happened. I just zapped out of here for a little bit.
You got back after 3 minutes. So that was your 3 minutes in hell, and now you're back resurrected.
Yeah, I think actually you put it well, Layman. And in the integral community following Benita Roy and Tom Murray and others, we sometimes talk about the integral diaspora, that there was a large centering around Ken Wilber, although he's not the original integrative thinker by any means, but he had gathered quite a movement around him. But there was also beginning to feel within the community that there was a kind of stifling that was happening because it was too personality centered, too focused on a single node. And so there's been a kind of spreading out and branching out, partly just naturally of people applying integrative thought in their own domains, and partly because there was a need, I think, to broaden the dialogue to individuals in the community rather than all constantly referring back to Ken Wilber. So I think that diasporic movement has happened, and within the integral community, there's been a development of something that we're calling complex integral realism, where we're bringing together Roy Bhaskar's thought and Edgar Morin's thought and integral thought. And that's kind of emblematic of what I think Layman just described also, of the similar move of trying to bring together metamodern, integral, and game B communities. And the same thing is seen exactly for complex thought of Edgar Morin and the meta-reality or the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar, all of these different approaches, they all basically recognize the same domains, the same kinds of concerns, but they naturally privilege some elements over others, just like Layman said. So that's been part of the impetus for bringing those three communities together in, kind of an emerging meta system, where it's not attempting to create a single syncretic organism, but to practice just the dancing between, while allowing the individuality or the individuality of each of these communities, not trying to create a single monolithic system, but benefiting from bringing them near each other, and in that space of maximal proximity, becoming eventuates. That's what happens. So we're really trying to foster in these different movements that the bringing together the different communities into maximal proximity to see what can emerge in the between. Part of my inspiration in that is William Desmond and his theology, metaxological theology, where he talks about the erotic move of the dialectic, and then the agapeic move after that of metaxology, of the between, the transcendence of the between. So I think there's that ethos that's running through what's happening in our communities and what we're trying to do in this particular channel in bringing so many different voices into dialogue.
Yeah, let me add one thing to that, which is I think that what's happening in these communities is a movement, a sort of fragmentation, but like a relational fragmentation, a movement away from system toward toolkit. Like Ken Wilber, for example, did a lot of really good work on grouping together the types of perspectives that shouldn't be left out, right? Like if you're looking at subjectivities, or you're looking at objectivities, or you're looking at developmental things, he made this big map of, this is all the stuff you would need to include. There may be other things, but if you leave any of these pieces out, you're going to get a distorted view of reality. So he's got this integral map, and it's really useful, but it seems it's a bit limiting to consider it to be one coherent thing, because it's not really that he made the perfect organization of those pieces. He brought those pieces together. And as long as everybody's playing with those pieces, as long as they've got singularity and plurality and subjectivity and intersubjectivity and objectivity and developmentalism and different personality types and different intelligences, you get all, and shadow material, as long as all of that's in your bag, then you could arrange that in a lot of different ways. And it turns out there are lots of communities and lots of good thinkers who have most of those pieces in play. And some people have discovered ones we don't know. There's some still to be discovered, I'm sure. But if you can unpack the notion of a unified system and just say, these are the pieces, then you find these other conversations where people are playing with a lot of those pieces. And then that's a meta conversation between all those people who are playing with all those different pieces in different ways. And that seems to illuminate something that seems like a whole new world.
Yeah, I would say I agree, because this is what's happening in Europe as well. That I even have a term that I use for called digital monasteries. Like, where will it go? What will happen next? Well, digital monasteries is like open. That could just be what we're doing right here. But it could also be actual physical places where people create communities where they try to experiment with new lifestyles. And these new lifestyles. I live in an arrangement myself with a lot of people here in Stockholm, Sweden. We have agreed on a specific lifestyle. We're living in certain conditions, and it works really well. And it basically is a model that can be copied. So it's just like, you could live like this instead of living alone or living in a traditional nuclear family. You could live this kind of arrangement, and it works. It worked for us. It could work for you. And I also think at the other end, if we're not too terrified of that, I would see Danish Schmachtenberg and Jordan Hall are old friends of mine, and I relate them to you guys. And yeah, some of these guys are going to become urban planners eventually. And for good or bad, I'm educated in urban planner. I'm an economic geographer. That's how I became an economist originally. But I also know the dangers of being the guy who's the Peter Pan who wants to decide how people are going to live their lives, right? That's what urban planners are obsessed with. And so I'm not defending urban planners per se, but they're desperately needed as well. We need proper planning how to live. We need urban planning. We need rural planning. We need suburban, exurban planning. We need to figure out how to do these things. And I think this whole movement could be a source of talents who would actually also do that. This is not just going to be conversations, and we're all dying to turn the conversations over the next few years into reality. And I would add there, that this goes for my religious conviction as well. Syntheism is an idea. Yes, it's an idea that can be incorporated into religion as it exists. It can certainly be turned into something new if you really have to. But personally, I went all the way back to Zoroastrianism, which is the original eventological religion that predates Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and also to a certain extent predates Buddhism and Taoism in the East. And because it connects East and West, I decided to convert, and I converted in 1992. And I often get to ask the question, so you are a practicing Zoroastrian. There are several million Zoroastrians around the world, and I travel all the time, and I get to see them. And I love that lifestyle, and I love the languages I've learned and cultures I've embraced because of it. But as a Western Zoroastrian convert, why would that be different from Syntheism? Well, really, you know what? I give you this example. When the Syntheism book was written, I went to Paris, which is the center of the Zoroastrian community in Europe. And it consists basically of very wealthy Iranians and Indians who live in exile, and a few converts like myself. So it's a very affluent community. They have a large center in the Rue Victor Hugo in Paris. And I get to see the Mobed, who is like the high priest of Europe of the Zoroastrian community. And he's a very friendly guy. He's a friend of mine. His name is Kamran. And I just present on the drawing board, like you do with philosophy, I present on the drawing board the whole idea of the Syntheism book. And he looks at it and he says, but this is exactly like Zoroastrianism, but without all the Iranian heritage garbage of 3,000 years. And I just embraced it totally and said, can I be a syntheist? And I said, yes, of course you can. Because when I did go back to the roots of religion and theology and discover there was a faith there that I could easily subscribe to, the way you join a political movement, when you don't agree on everything, but you agree on enough of it and you agree on the basics of it, you can actually subscribe to it and say, this will be part of my personal identity. I will devote myself to this community. Now, that can be a community that is 4,000 years old. And believe me, it has a lot of advantages. I can tell the Christians, no, you haven't been around long enough to understand these things, which is kind of wonderful. But I can also be in the other end of it, which say that, well, we can also think of religion that might even be created after we've died. But what kind of precursors could we be to that religion? What could we possibly do today to open up people to embrace a certain term and unify around a certain flag or whatever to create a movement that can stand out? And here is where I use the word exodology, where it's so important to me. To me, I'm scared of all the lynch mobs we see in society today. They're very Sibelian. They're dark force. But it's also interesting to think of the opposite of the lynch mob. And the opposite of the lynch mob historically is the Exodus. And the Exodus is out of the old into the new. It doesn't kill the old. It doesn't kill the members of the old. It even offers the members of the old to be part of the new. But it basically tells people, you can be part of the new. And if you're part of the new, we make the Exodus. We go somewhere. We establish the new, we take our theory into practice, and we live according to the new. And since human beings, according to René Girard, are very good at mimicking one another, what we always need as humans is we need somebody to do the right thing at the right time. So then at least the rest of us are offered the possibility to mimic it. And I think that's what we need today. I think we need both on a sort of very basic level, these sort of digital monasteries in rural communities and who leave the cities, go out in the countryside and get a few friends together and purchase a farm and there they establish the kind of lifestyle that they think is the right one. Experiments like that have been going on for the last 50 years. They should definitely be maintained. But there are also people who can go to the other end of this, which is going to real philosophical, political, academic discourse and get in charge of the urban planning jobs for the major cities and try to redirect lifestyles and things in those cities in a much better, more sustainable way. I think we can go in both directions. So it's like we can go historically, go back to roots, but we can also think future, and we can also at the same time, both vertical and horizontally, we can do the same thing where we put our priorities. Because as you said, and you described it generally here, but there's a really interesting discourse going on in North America and Europe. It's very united. The Stoa in Toronto is a perfect example of that. The intellectual deep web is a perfect example of that. There's so many new communities that are growing now and different projects that are happening, and they're codependent with one another and they inspire each other. And out of this movement, eventually, there has to be practical results. There have to be people on the ground who live a life that is different from the previous lives they lived before, and who can tell that story. So, can I just ask one more thing? So you describe yourself in a very generalist way when we talked about metamodernism and integral and game B theory here before, but if you would dare to be more specialist, what exactly do you personally, you Layman and you Bruce, what are you involved with personally? Because I read your papers, Layman, and they're great, so I highly recommend them. But what are you writing at the moment, for example, Layman?
Well, I'll let Bruce answer that first.
Okay.
The question being basically, how do we identify ourselves more particularly? My practice for many, many years has been Buddhism, but I don't identify strongly with Buddhism anymore. It's the path I went into most deeply, especially I started out actually following Krishnamurti's work and really valuing just what the kind of he's not entirely so, but kind of the post-metaphysical attempt to extract the practice from the the deeper religious embedment. That's what attracted me early on, but eventually I got hungry for the narratives, and I realized I didn't have to be cut off from the narratives the way that I felt initially in my teens that I needed to do. So I turned back and was able to look at religion in new ways, and was able to enter into Buddhist practice, I think, with a new lens after kind of the excisions, of extracting me from Judeo-Christian culture and going into just the hard practice with Krishnamurti. Then I was able to kind of return to other traditions and hold them in a different way. And so I've gone pretty deeply into Buddhism, especially I started with Vipassana, but then moved into Tibetan and especially Bonpo community, which is rich strata of shamanic and magical practice, all the way up to high philosophical and high contemplative practice in Dzogchen, and things like that. So that's been the practice I've been with probably the most deeply. Currently, I work with time-space knowledge teachings of Tartang Tulku. And again, I think those just provide a wonderful set of inquiry tools to work with, to reflect on basically time, space, and knowingness or consciousness as threads in the fabric of our experience, and how you can work with those things creatively to explore self and world dynamics. So that's been a big part of my practice. I don't have a strong commitment to any single tradition anymore. And if I found something that really resonated, I might do that again. But for right now, I'm just drawing what works for me from the places that I've been enriched by and studied, and trying to synthesize and integrate my own kinds of practices based on those experiences.
Great. I should just add there that I'm studying Vajrayana Buddhism intensely at the moment. And this because the Process and Event book that I'm writing with Syntheist, the last of the 3 books in the Grand Narrative trilogy, is going to start and end with the Silk Route. And we work with the Silk Route triad here. We work with the 3 religions along the Silk Route, which is the Indian version, which is Buddhism, the Persian version, which is Zoroastrianism, and the Chinese version, which is Taoism. And they're just different schools of thought along an entire trade route. There was no ism anywhere, really. And that's how I got interested in Vajrayana, because it has such strong Persian components to it that I don't think a lot of Westerners see. But since I was well-versed in Persian philosophy before I started studying Vajrayana, I'm just like, God, yeah, there's so much here that is Persian, at least as much as there's Indian or even Chinese influences in Tibetan Buddhism that I found so rich. So
in the community that I'm in, which especially draws teachings from Zhangzhung and other old traditions and communities, there's a clear recognition of a Persian connection between Dzogchen and earlier Persian thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to discuss that more in detail when I'm really, really immersed in it, because Zoroastrianism and Buddhism has a fantastic shared history over the last 2,000 years. It's really, really amazing. So, Layman, how about you? What are you working on in terms of papers and things and writing at the moment?
Yeah, well, I'll do like Bruce did and start with a little bit of, I guess, religious background. I grew up in a kind of Taoist neo-pagan household, although obviously you can't get away from the Christian background of our culture, so I try to take that seriously to some degree. I ended up living in a Buddhist Sangha for many years, and I tried to supplement that by going to every other possible religious community at the time so that I would be balanced. So we would do these ceremonies every Sunday. And so every Sunday morning before the ceremony, I would go to some different religious group's Sunday ceremony. So I ended up visiting every kind of temple and organization in the community. And so as a result, I started to think of it in very abstract terms. Now I'm obviously still spend a lot of my time with spirituality and religion, but I think of it in terms of what Bruce and I call integral post-metaphysical spirituality. I think of it in terms of what I call my integration surplus model of how things are brought together to produce those experiences, even though there has to be some ontology backing that up. I see it through the lens of the metaphysics of adjacency, where almosts and not quites can be thought of as fundamental.
You got to go back to that word. Adjacency is really your word. So explain why you got hooked on that concept and explain it.
It was interesting because I was in this discussion community that Bruce was running, and there was a lot of discussion about post-metaphysics. And so I was constantly thinking, what is the metaphysics that enables post-metaphysics? And I was going to see my friend who was in the Buddhist community with me, and I would always get off the bus and take that hour-long walk through the woods to get to his house rather than just go on the bus. And I was walking by this lake in the woods, and it just started to seem to me that the thing that all of these higher theoretical worldviews have in common is boundary conditions. Right? And whether the boundary condition is a sort of postmodern look at the interplay of different contexts, or whether it's an integral view of how all those different kinds of contexts can be brought together, nonetheless, on an integral map, there's still all these boundary lines. What separates these different zones? And so I was thinking a lot about those zones, and they're always next to each other, right? So you could say, hey, that's just your opinion, man. But what I'm saying then is that our two contexts are somehow in a relationship. They're next to each other. And likewise, if we say they're absolutely connected, that you can never have a subjectivity without an objectivity, like Wilber claims, still you're saying these two contexts are next to each other. And that next to could be really close, it could be really loose, could be far away. There's all these different kinds of dynamics about that next to-ness. So I started to think about the way in which it's impossible to conceive of meta perspectives without relying on the adjacency of perspectives, of contexts. And then I started to think, well, maybe that adjacency is more primordial than the context, or the contexts themselves, in order to operate, always depend on that. Because even if you say, my context is the only context and your context is wrong, you're still setting up a relational dynamic in which they're next to each other. And when you start to think of next tos and adjacencies and then almosts, they're really pervasive. Like time itself is always, there's always a next, and space is sort of an extension of the concept of next to. So there's all these ways in which a slight offset, a displacement, is actually the necessary form of thinking. And then that's
very Hegelian. So you would basically say that the approximation is more exact than the exact position.
That's right. My code phrase for that is 99 is the new 100%.
Yeah, I get it completely. Yeah, I just want to fill in here that we're studying the concept of cosmopolitanism. And even if Derrida and Levinas and other guys did that in the 20th century, they didn't really think of it in terms of territory, which I find interesting. And here comes in that the Persians had the only empire that lasted for 2,200 years. And what's interesting is the Persian Empire lasted for 2,200 years. The Egyptians tried empire once, it lasted for 6 years, because the Egyptians went for tyranny and dictatorship, and the Persians went for power sharing. And believe it or not, but what's great about the United States is the United States Constitution, and the fact that it has power sharing built into it and checks and balance built into it from the very beginning is actually heritage that goes all the way back to ancient Persia. And what's interesting is that in the cosmopolitan world where we all live today, say that would have been like Babylon, or a major city like Rome or something like that in the past. It would be New York or London today. Well, digital is a city like that. It's like a massive city of 8 billion people. And we have to be cosmopolitan. But what's interesting that when you go to the imperial realm, which is actually older than the national realm, we're all born to be tribal. And adjacency is then really about, to me, it's about how tribes interconnect with one another. How do you relate to the other tribe? Well, the approximation is done better than the exactment. It's actually less costly to figure out an approximation. And it's probably more interesting and more true anyway, because you realize that you yourself are an approximation. You were never exact in the first place. Your own self is an approximation. So what's interesting is that the imperial realm is one where you have a shared court language. So you have a shared language you can use across the entire empire, but you never attempt to introduce the court language to local populations. You allow the local population to speak any language they like. Well, you can practice any specific religion you want that is based on that locality. And what people simply saw in the Persian Empire was that, wait a second, that if you go to a mountain area or you go to a river valley, you're probably going to have very different religions to begin with. Why don't we have different religions in that case? If you're a military guy or you're a monk, you will have different religions. Well, why don't you have different religions? Men and women have different ideas coming out of religion too. Matriarchy and patriarchy, very different things, very different responsibilities. So when you see this sort of wide variety of religion as a pluralist, you see what the Persian idea originally was, which I think is a fantastic contribution we need to return to today. And then you can look at nation. A nation is when you and I speak exactly the same language. We have a shared heritage. We might even have a shared forefathers or whatever. And we can embrace nationality in that sense, understand that nationality is not good enough any longer in a globalized world where we have to go truly imperial. So these concepts that we work with, imperial national, fit perfectly into your concept of adjacency. That's why I'm so interested in it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, sorry, Bruce, you want to go?
You go first. I'll follow.
All right. I thought of two things when you were saying that. And first is, very simple ideas about adjacency in terms of a positioning in which something new becomes active, the right kind of relating, right? And we used to do a lot of energy work training in my Buddhist community, and there's a thing that happens. There's something that doesn't happen when your hands together, and there's something that doesn't happen when your hands are far apart. There's something that happens when your hands are here, which is they start to tingle if you're tuned into it, right? And that's the same thing with people. It's the same thing with erotic relationships. It's the notion of the beach or the tidal pool as a generative mechanism for life somewhere between the land and the ocean. There's all these activations that happen at thresholds, right? Hypothetically, an electromagnetic field fills the entire universe, but it doesn't really mean anything until those magnets are close. So being close is somehow part of the activating mechanism of all the interesting phenomenon that we're interested in. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the way that the dialogue that I think of Dharma as conversation rather than as a set body of knowledge that you can receive. It's an ongoing conversation that allows you to adapt to any given space, right? Different ecosystems and different cultural ecosystems and different worldviews are spaces at different scales in which the conversation of the Dharma can emerge. And when the conversation goes on, people begin to accumulate the insights and the skill practices that go along with filling that space. And I think we can get a very primitive notion of what those general skills and insights are applicable to any space and scale, but they're still always going to show up in adaptation to that style. So the local style, the tribal style, has to be preserved and protected and made healthy, and likewise the national scale and likewise the global scale. And all of our knowledge environment also has to be built into that. I think one of the things that modern thinkers have not understood about religion is that it adapts to the knowledge structure of its day, right? That religion was not non-scientific when, Paul brought forth Christianity 2,000 years ago. It was up on the science of its day. And if religion was emerging as those conversations of the Dharma occur today, it will enfold the knowledge space of today. So it's only religion if it's up to speed to the universes in which it's performing this function of general transcendental integration. And, I have a lot of interesting conversations with John Vervaeke, who's down the road from me in Ontario, and he asked me to contribute to his book on dialogue. And I wrote this piece called...
You're my first flight ticket post-corona, so you know that. So there you go.
I wrote this thing called The Transcendental Interlocutor for his anthology on dialogue. And it's basically looks at healthy forms of religion as dialogue-based attempts to generate some kind of surplus spirit that moves people, and then how we can keep that going forward and how we can understand the quality of the dialogue that's emerging in these broader communities of higher discussion as an aspect of a religious phenomenon. That's what religion's always been doing, has been bringing forth that numinous quality through the right kinds of conversation skills, regenerating the Dharma in a way that's adaptive to world spaces.
Oh yeah, fundamentalism as we know it today was invented in the 19th century. It was essentially, when marketing became screaming in mass media, fundamentalism was invented. And I always thought of fundamentalism as the last stage of religion before it dies. It's like a supernova. It's like when you no longer believe in your God, you force other people to believe in your God for you through bombs, right? And dogmas. And it doesn't make any sense historically at all. The world or civilization was built through trade routes. And we got over the warfare of building temples between communities. If you had two rivers that were constant war with one another, finally one day, one guy from each river would just, walk up the stairs to the temple and said, actually, we don't have two different religions. We have a shared ancestry. Okay, so we're going to have the entire river valley, both rivers now united together as, as a constitutive community. So we don't have to go war with one another, and actually we start trading instead. And these trade routes are the origin of religion. That's where it comes from. It was always dialogue. It was always like, anybody decent, person with a decent self-confidence, would be curious about what other people think about God and nature and culture or whatever. So, it's, and you would have healthy kids. You wouldn't tell your kids what to believe. You would encourage your kids to go out there in the world and find their way and mimic you when they would have to, and then finally rebel against you and become themselves. That is deeply human. That is what religion has always been. So this kind of fundamentalist aspect, this kind of dogmatic idea what religion, or for that matter, scientists or scientism is today, is actually very, very recent in history and very specific for our culture. It's not at all what religion has been historically.
Layman referenced the forum that we were in together, an integral post-metaphysical spirituality forum. And one of the things that really sparked our renewed relationship there was this exploration of boundaries and relatedness. My own writing for a long time is centered around interreligious and intercultural relationship and dialogue, and exploring the mechanisms and the metaphysics and the practices that are involved in that. And one thing that grew out of we kind of had parallel inquiries on the forum. One thing that grew out of that for me was I began to look at what are the underlying implicit metaphysical presumptions that inform integral theory. And it seems to, and I was looking at especially the debates in object-oriented ontology between those who seem to focus more on object and thing, and those who seem to focus more on relationship and process, and noticing that there was a privileging of either the kind of a nounal or a verbal orientation. And so I started to explore that and found that actually you can look through history and see different parts of speech form kind of philosophemes that basically structure the metaphysical system of the time. So there are nounal and structural metaphysics and verbal process metaphysics. There's adjectival metaphysics, which focus mostly on qualitative experience. There is pronounal, which is what integral theory uses, where it focuses mostly on perspective. Then there is adverbial, which focuses on mode of becoming, and prepositional, which focuses on relationship. I see, for instance, a Whiteheadian approach, mainly emphasizing adverbial and prepositional philosophemes in structuring, its worldview, its process worldview. And so, yeah, that became really deeply interesting to me. And what I've been wanting to look at in terms of our project here on the integral stage in the broader integrative communities and meta modern and game B communities really is especially the notion of the preposition and what it is pointing to, the following Michel Serres or Latour and other people, where the preposition opens a kind of, it's a vector space that prepositions what is emerging, that, you know, any kind of appearance of things alongside each other don't appear in neutral space, but there's always a relational vector that's going on there, and the preposition points to those dynamics. And preposition represents kind of sites of integration, sites of relation. And in my dialogue with Layman, it's sites of alongsidedness, sites of adjacency.
We're even developing a complete emergence vector theory for the history of the universe for our next book.
Wonderful.
Listen, guys, I'm going to go off in a few minutes, but I love this conversation. And I would love to stay in touch and certainly continue this conversation whenever you guys are up to it. I love it. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all.
Am I sort of cutting it short here? We've run 2 hours into it already, and it's like there's got to be so much material already here. But I trust you guys completely to do as you please with the materials, as you were kind enough to record it and promise to edit it. I'm going to talk to my friends over here, invite you guys over, probably both separately and together for further conversations. But this just opened, you know, if we close the door now, we opened 10 new ones. So it's just, I love this conversation.
I haven't even mentioned shamanism, Zen.
Yeah. And Bruce, you're so scholared. I mean, you know these things so well. Which is I love, and so do you, Layman. So if I may kindly call Bruce the logos and Layman the pathos here, and together we try to create a mythos together tonight, then that would be, I think, a good ending for this conversation.
Been very nice to be with you, Alexander.
The same. Cheers to a transatlantic brotherhood. Here we go.
Yeah.